They say when you're deep underwater in a cave, you lose all sense of time. No sun, no shadows, just the sound of your own breath echoing through your skull like a ticking clock. For Kai Kankan, that ticking got louder every second as he stared into the abyss of Plura Cave, Norway's underwater tomb. What started as a planned expedition with his closest diving comrades would end in a nightmarish descent into freezing blackness. And this time, there would be no second chances, because once you pass a certain depth, there is no turning back, no rescue, no surface, only death. And in February of 2014, death was already waiting for them. On February 6, 2014, 5 elite cave divers from Finland arrived at the mouth of Plura Cave, a frigid, water-filled tunnel buried deep in the Norwegian wilderness. The group had one goal: to traverse the entire submerged system from entrance to exit, a dangerous underwater journey that very few had ever attempted. But what none of them could have foreseen was that this journey would become one of the worst caving disasters in Scandinavian history. At the center of this expedition was 46-year-old Kai Kankan, a seasoned diver known for his calm demeanor and tactical precision. But beneath that exterior was a man haunted by grief. Just 1 year prior, Kai had lost his best friend and diving partner in a cave diving accident in Finland's Mantatar quarry. It was a death that shook the entire diving community and nearly ended Kai's career. But instead of retreating from the abyss, he returned to it, drawn back by some unspoken force, maybe guilt, maybe the desperate need to reclaim control. Joining Kai were 4 others: 42-year-old Patrick Rankvist, a calculated and technically gifted diver with nerves of steel; 40-year-old Jari Huetarinen, whose calm under pressure made him an invaluable asset; 34-year-old Jari Huetumaki, younger but bold, known for his daring stunts and deep dives; and finally 33-year-old Vesa Rantan, the youngest of the crew, whose enthusiasm was rivaled only by his growing expertise. They were all elite divers, people who didn't just swim through submerged caves, they lived for it. People who considered 30 meters underwater to be a warm-up. People who trained to face darkness, tight squeezes and zero visibility without fear. But even for them, Plura was something different. It was Europe's deepest known cave, an icy winding maze with deadly siphons, blind corners and drop-offs that could swallow a man whole. Even with top-tier equipment and years of experience, a single mistake could be lethal. Their plan was to enter the cave through a submerged crack in the frozen Plura River and exit through the Steinugal Flaget cave system. An ambitious plan that involved navigating newly discovered passages at depths exceeding 100. That meant they would be exposed to crushing pressure, temperatures near freezing, and the ever-present risk of decompression sickness. The full dive was expected to take over 5 hours under ideal conditions, but Plura didn't offer ideal conditions. On the morning of February 6, the team arrived at the Plura River, where the surface was blanketed in thick crystalline ice. After carefully measuring their entry point, they cut a triangular hole through the ice and began setting up their gear. There were no crowds, no onlookers, just the 5 of them and the cold, whispering wind. They had decided on a staggered dive plan would follow, giving the sediment time to settle and visibility a chance to recover. This delay was crucial. One wrong kick could cloud the water into a pitch-black soup. As Patrick and Jari slipped beneath the surface and descended into the flooded cave, the temperature immediately dropped to a bone-chilling 40. Their suits were specially designed to keep them dry, but even the best thermal gear had limits. Visibility was minimal. Only the focused beams from their headlamps cut through the water, casting narrow cones of light onto jagged rock walls, and the occasional silt cloud drifting lazily like underwater smoke. The first leg of the dive took them 500 meters in, descending steadily to a depth of 30. There they reached the first major landmark, an air-filled chamber that stretched over 250 meters long. It was a rare moment of reprieves. Somewhere they could briefly surface, check gear, and recalibrate. Everything was going smoothly. Too smoothly. From there they pushed onward, deeper into the most treacherous portion of the cave. Ahead lay a tight, sharp-angled passage nicknamed the trapdoor. A bottleneck so narrow a diver had to completely exhale to squeeze through it. Patrick went first, but as he was angling into the bend, he noticed Jari Huete's flashlight begin to flicker, then go completely dark. A moment later the beam returned, but it was flashing erratically. Emergency signal. Patrick turned and saw Jari flailing, his eyes wide behind the mask. One of his backup cylinders, known as a bailout tank, had snagged on the jagged cave wall. He was stuck, and panic had overtaken him. Underwater panic is one of the deadliest scenarios in technical diving. Breathing accelerates, oxygen gets depleted, fine motor skills vanish, and at over 100 meters deep there is no one coming to help. Patrick acted fast. He ditched his scooter and swam back, maneuvering carefully to avoid entangling himself. He reached for the cylinder, braced himself against the wall and nudged it forward, freeing Jari from the obstruction. But what Patrick saw next chilled him more than the surrounding water ever could. Jari's regulator, the mouthpiece supplying him air, had somehow been knocked loose. His body jerked, limbs flailing. Patrick lunged and shoved the regulator back into Jari's mouth. But it was too late. His friend's eyes were already dull. His body stopped moving. The water inside his lungs had done its job. Patrick froze. He wanted to scream, to shake his friend awake. But he couldn't. He was nearly 400 feet underground in a black liquid tube. The only sound was his own breath, and the steady beep of his dive computer. He looked down. The number on the screen made his blood run cold. 400 minutes. That was the new required decompression time, over 6 hours longer than they'd planned. The more time he spent at that depth, the more dangerous it became to surface. There was no time to grieve. Patrick had to move, and so, with his dead friend's body behind him, he turned and swam toward the second entrance, toward survive. 2 hours later, the second team, Kai Visser and Jari Hugh, began their descent, unaware of what had just happened. As they reached the deeper section of the cave, the visibility was still decent, and the familiar markers gave them a false sense of security. But then Visser heard it, a faint, erratic beeping, a distress signal. He swam toward the source, and in the distance something came into view. Floating, unmoving, Jari Hueteranen's body. Visser froze. It took everything he had not to turn back immediately, but there was no room to avoid it. The passage was too tight. Behind him, Jari Hugh approached, and immediately lost his composure. He began hyperventilating, thrashing in the narrow space. Panic. Kai tried to grab him, calm him down, but it was too late. Jari Hugh ripped at his regulator, then clutched his chest. Within seconds he stopped moving. Another life gone. Kai's instincts kicked in. He swam to Visser, who was now trying to squeeze past the body in a state of near hysteria. Kai shouted through his mask, gesturing for him to stop, to turn back. Visser wouldn't listen. Kai had seen enough. He turned around, and once again the cave swallowed a diver whole. Kai Kakantine didn't look back. He couldn't. Behind him, the bodies of two teammates floated lifeless, suspended in the icy blackness. Ahead lay a twisting, narrow path that would take him back the way they came, toward the Plora River entrance, now over 1,000 meters behind him. He swam slowly and deliberately, resisting every natural instinct screaming at him to flee faster, because speed meant stirring silt, and silt meant blindness. In Plora Cave, blindness meant death. Meanwhile, Visser Rantin was still pressing forward against all odds. He had refused to turn around, refused to abandon the exit path. Perhaps he couldn't accept the idea of backtracking. Perhaps he knew that he might not have enough air to return the way he came. but forward meant pushing past the body of Jari Hues, who now blocked the passage entirely. Visser kicked, clawed and twisted through the gap, tearing his suit in the process. It was a miracle the suit didn't flood, but he made it through. He had no idea Kai had turned back. He had no clue if Patrick had survived. He thought he might be alone. 3 men, 3 different directions, each assuming the others had died. For Patrick Grankvist, survival had become mathematical. Every breath, every meter climbed, had to be carefully timed to avoid decompression sickness, a deadly condition that could rupture your lungs or paralyze you if you surfaced too quickly. His decompression timer had ballooned to 400 minutes, nearly 7 hours of mandatory decompression stops at set depth, and he had to do it alone. He floated in place, eyes closed, trying not to move, trying not to think, but how could he not? Behind him was Jari's body, in his head the sound of his last breath, the image of his eyes. He forced himself to stay present. He had mapped out every stage of the dive. He knew this cave better than most people know their own homes. He reached the Steinorgel Flagja chamber around 9:00 p.m. and a half hours after entering the water. His limbs were weak, his body trembling, but he was alive, and just 1 hour later, to his shock, he heard movement from the water. They stared at each other, stunned. No words, just nods. The two sat in silence, breathing, shivering, grateful to not be alone. On the other end of the cave system, Kai emerged from the dark tunnel into the frozen pond, where they had entered earlier. The hole they'd cut that morning had partially refrozen. He punched through it with his gloved fists, dragging himself into the frigid air. It was nearly 1:30. He lay on the ice for a few minutes, then crawled back to the van. Heart pounding, he wrapped himself in emergency blankets, eyes fixed on the dark woods ahead. Would he ever see the others again? At 2:00 a.m., headlights flickered through the trees. Patrick and Visser had made it out. 3 out of 5 had survived. News of the tragedy spread quickly. Emergency teams arrived within hours, but Plora Cave refused to give up the bodies easily. Recovery was impossible under normal conditions. Norwegian officials declared the underwater section a grave, citing the extreme danger, but the Finnish team refused to accept this. In a mission that stunned the world, surviving members of the team, including Kai, returned weeks later, risking their lives again to bring their friends home. It was one of the deepest underwater body recovery operations in history, and it was successful. They didn't leave their dead behind, but just 4 years later, another team of cavers would find themselves in even deeper danger, not underwater, but miles beneath the surface of the earth, in a place so remote, so untouched by light or life, that it felt like descending into the underworld itself. Welcome to Verefkina Cave. Verefkina Cave, descent into the deepest pit on earth, hidden within the Arabica Massif of the Western Caucasus Mountains in Abkhazia. Verefkina is not just a cave, it's a vertical nightmare. At 2,212 meters, 7,257 feet deep, it is the deepest known cave in the world. Fewer people have reached its bottom than have walked on the moon. To descend it is to walk into a world that has never seen sunlight, a place where water drips in silence, and the walls close in like the ribs of a buried beast. In September 2018, a Russian team, led by veteran speleologist Pavel Demidov, returned to the cave to explore it further, this time joined by British cave photographer Robbie Schoen and his assistant Jeff Wade. Their mission: they were prepared, or so they thought. Each team member carried over 30 kgs of gear, including food, climbing equipment, thermal clothing and survival tools. The first 32 meters of the cave was a sheer vertical shaft, just the beginning of a multi-day descent. Their journey would take them across twisting corridors, through freezing rivers, tight crawl spaces, and chambers so massive they could fit entire buildings. They camped at multiple levels, setting up base camps at 600 meter, 100 meter Wasi, and eventually at the bottom near 2100 meter, where they planned to stay for over a week. On day 7, disaster struck. Roman and Natalia, 2 members of the team who had left the day before to catch a flight, had just reached the surface when they heard it. A thunderous rumble,
Like a jet engine buried under stone, thousands of gallons of water began surging into the upper cave system. They immediately contacted the base team via cable line. Flood pulse incoming, they warned. Robbie, Pavel and the rest at the bottom weren't concerned. Flood pulses were rare, but they happened. The system had survived them before. They were wrong. Suddenly, a jet of freezing water burst through a nearby fissure, just meters from their camp. It wasn't a trickle. It was a torrent. Robbie moved fast. He strapped on his climbing gear, double-checked his ascenders, clipped into the static rope, and began climbing upward, into darkness and rushing water. The others scrambled behind him. One wrong move, one snapped rope, and they'd be buried forever. The water pounded them. Visibility dropped. The cold was unbearable. The walls were slick with mud. Robbie reached a junction point, a slanted ledge 400 meters up. He gasped for air, shaking uncontrollably. Then movement. Jeff Wade emerged from the shadows behind him, coughing, soaked, but alive. Neither knew if anyone else had survived. They didn't wait. They kept climbing. Hours passed. They reached the 1900-meter camp and collapsed. 15 minutes later, headlamps flickered again. The Russian team had made it. For over 20 hours they waited in silence as the cave groaned around them. Water still flowed, an underground beast that refused to be calmed. Finally, the torrent subsided. One by one they resumed their ascent, climbing, crawling, enduring. After 4 more days they reached daylight. They had survived, just barely. Most cave stories begin with rock, water, and depth, but Ted's story begins with obsession. Unlike the others, this wasn't a scientific expedition, a record-breaking descent, or a government-approved dive. This was one man, one hole, and a voice deep underground that refused to stay silent. What happened inside that cave has never been confirmed. No official recovery, no conclusive evidence, no photographs, only a string of eerie journal entries left behind by a man who would eventually vanish, and a single phrase that still haunts those who read his blog. "Be at peace. I will conquer this cave." He never posted again. In early 2001, a man identifying himself only as Ted began posting a personal log on a primitive blog site. At first glance, the entries seemed like harmless caving journals, his experiences exploring a small unnamed cave system, with his close friend B somewhere in the deserts of the American Southwest. But as the logs continued, a strange pattern emerged. The language grew darker, the entries longer, the tone more desperate. Ted's first notable post came on March 23, 2001. He recounted a December trip months earlier, with B, during which they had discovered a narrow passage inside a cave they had frequented for years. This wasn't just another tunnel, it was a vertical, jagged hole. A sliver of darkness maybe 8 inches wide at its tightest point. But what made it stand out wasn't just the shape, it was the sound. From deep inside that crack came a wind, constant, whispering, pulse. It was blowing outward as if the earth itself were exhaling. And behind that wind, something stranger. A low, deep rumble like distant thunder, but never ending. Ted became obsessed. He measured the hole, drew diagrams, compared the vibrations to known geological activity. He even brought B's dog into the cave on a later trip, hoping she might crawl into the gap. Instead, the dog stopped mid-stride and whimpered. Then she bolted. On January 27, 2001, Ted and B returned the Sime armed with drills, chisels and sledgehammers. Their goal: widen the tunnel just enough for a human to crawl through. It was excruciating work. Because of the narrow space, only one person could dig at a time. Ted described lying on his side for hours, hammering against rock, every swing echoing in his skull like a gunshot. The dust choked him, his shoulders ached, his chest compressed, but he didn't stop. After several trips, they made real progress. The hole widened by inches, the wind grew stronger, the rumble grew louder. By February, the entries took a chilling turn. On one visit, as B worked near the entrance, he jerked up and shouted, "Did you hear that?" Ted hadn't, but B swore something had scraped across the inside of the tunnel like rock grinding on rock, or something dragging. They shrugged it off. They had to. They were deep underground with no help. If you let fear in, it would never leave. But the next time they went down, the screaming started. Ted wrote that as he lay in the tunnel, guiding a chisel into the final inches of the rock wall. A sound tore through the cave. It was like metal being scraped across glass, high-pitched, long, and full of rage. Both men froze. The sound repeated, then vanished. Despite their fear, curiosity won. Always. On March 3rd they returned. The hole was now just barely large enough for a man to squeeze through. Arms pinned, chest compressed. Ted insisted on going first. He stripped off excess gear and slid headfirst into the new tunnel. Every movement was calculated. One wrong shift, and he could become lodged, trapped forever, with no one able to pull him free. But he made it through. What he found on the other side defied explanation. It was a chamber roomy, unnatural, as if the rock had been hollowed out deliberately. A single large round stone sat at the far end, perfectly smooth and leaning against the wall like a sealed door. Near it, markings etched into the stone, crude yet deliberate, human-like shapes, surrounding a symbol Ted couldn't understand. He stared in silence, then he turned and crawled back. Weeks later, on April 14th, Ted and Bea returned, this time with a friend named Joe. They needed a third set of eyes. Ted had seen something he couldn't explain, and Bea wanted to verify it wasn't some hallucination from exhaustion or sensory deprivation. But before Ted could enter the tunnel again, he slipped and slammed his head on the cave wall hard. He blacked out briefly, likely concussed. So Joe went in instead. He was gone 25 minutes, far longer than expected. When he emerged, he was white as a sheet, sweating, shaking, refusing to speak. All he said before leaving the cave forever was, "I don't feel good." Ted never saw him again. On April 28th, Ted and Bea returned with new gear. Ted crawled back into the tunnel. He reached the chamber. Everything looked the same, except the round stone had moved, and the phone line was severed. The rock was on top of it. He cracked a glow stick. Nothing. Then something brushed against the back of his leg. He didn't look. He didn't scream. He just crawled harder and faster than ever. Behind him, the smell of decay filled the tunnel. Thick, wet, unnatural. He burst from the tunnel gasping for air. But before he could speak, the sounds returned. Scraping, grinding from inside the chamber. Something was following. As they scrambled for the rope ladder leading out of the cave, Ted saw it. The rope jerked, as if being pulled back down. Screamed. He drew his knife and cut the rope. They never went back. A few weeks later, Ted posted one final blog entry. "For my family and friends who are reading this, I say be at peace. I will conquer this cave. Then I will return and update this website immediately. I expect to be home later tonight or tomorrow at the latest. See all of you soon," with a lot of answers. Love, Ted. No further updates ever came.